Good morning. A few things before we really get going here. Looks like most everybody got the test done. I think you probably found that the tests tend to be fairly difficult, and that'll be the case throughout the semester. I say that, one, to encourage you to, of course, study harder for the future tests, but then two, to remind you that the tests make up half your grade. The other half of your grade is assignment, quizzes, and of course the discussions. So it's quite easy actually in this class, and I've had lots of people do it, even average a D on their test and end up with a C or maybe even a B in the class. And in fact that happens quite often, and so the point there is that don't despair, and I'm certainly not encouraging you not to study for future tests very hard, but don't despair if your test score was below what you maybe are accustomed to, and do the other stuff and do it well, and you shouldn't worry then too much about your score. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the discussions that we got going on, and because they've kind of, a couple of them have, at least one of them here is wrapped up, right? The Ashley Madison one, and so I want to just talk about it a little bit and go through kind of the things that I would have wanted to see, and for the most part did see from you guys. So the Ashley Madison lawsuit, and I think most or several people correctly pointed out that the initial hack was certainly a criminal offense. It's illegal to enter into somebody else's property, really, whether that property is real estate or whether that property is a server or a computer system. Okay, and so certainly that would be an illegality, right? Then you move forward and you say that would also be a civil problem too, not just criminal. That act would also be a civil act. Okay, that's they could be sued for. So the hackers could certainly be tried for criminal, and Ashley Madison themselves, or the folks whose information was exposed, could certainly sue the hackers, right? Because they violated due care. They did things wrong. It's important to note that in most events, most types of events like that, there is both a criminal and a civil case. Just a simple example is a car wreck, right? Most times a car wreck happens because somebody violated a rule or a law. They ran a stop sign, they were speeding, didn't yield the right of way, driving recklessly, whatever the case may be. So there's generally a violation of law, number one, and then number two, that's also a tort, okay, or a civil thing, because they also didn't exercise due care, right? And so there's generally both items in the same, in the same offense, okay? And in this case, you go, a step further and you say, now, did Ashley Madison violate any laws? No, and they probably didn't, but did they have a duty to protect their client's information? Absolutely, and they did not, and so certainly that's a civil case, and certainly clients of Ashley Madison will probably sue them, although again I find that interesting that to participate in that lawsuit, of course, you would have to expose yourself as being a client of Ashley Madison, so they may have a difficult time finding potential clients, although if you've already been exposed, if your spouse has already found out that you were a client, then of course you would sue and hope to recoup some money for your loss of whatever. I thought that one was a lot of fun. As for, I don't think anybody really speculated as to the ultimate outcome there. And as I speculate, there's no question that Ashley Madison didn't exercise due care, and so there's no question that um, they'll lose probably lawsuits or settle lawsuits. We oftentimes don't see the settlement of these things because they will settle, and settlements can be outside of court, basically, and so and they can be private. Settlements can, whereas if it went all the way through court, it would be public. I would further speculate that Ashley Madison won't survive this, that they're, it'll be too costly, and it very well could bankrupt the company in order to pay out those kinds of claims. Although I saw just a headline, and I didn't read the article just the other day, that said Ashley Madison's still adding new clients. So go figure. But that's an interesting case. We've still got the roof one ongoing, and again, as a reminder, those people in Group 2, you guys are required to put information in there, to post information. We got a lot of posts already, so there's already been some interesting discussion there. And again, I think you guys have correctly pointed out, I don't want to get too far ahead, but I think you guys have correctly pointed out that there's both civil and criminal actions that have potentially taken place here. The civil was the trespass by the company. And why do I call that civil instead of criminal? Well, you could maybe call it criminal, right? If you went on somebody's property and you vandalize it and you do those types of things, that's criminal. Just tearing off a roof, okay? Certainly you could charge them for that. I just don't think that, given that it was an accident and they acknowledged that it was an accident and there was no intent, I absolutely don't think that you would ever get any kind of a conviction, okay, for trespassing there. But certainly they didn't exercise due care, and so they have a duty. They have a duty of exercising due care, and they didn't exercise that, and so they're going to have to pay, or make square the gal whose roof got torn off, and then you get to the criminal side of it, or the public, more so than the criminal, is the injunction, right? Now, whether or not there's been some criminal activity that's taken place, maybe not, right? But the injunction then becomes a very public law type of a thing, and so we've got public law for sure. Maybe some criminal action that took place. I'm not going to speculate yet because you guys still have some week to discuss that, and so I'll look forward maybe to your guys' speculation as to what you think the outcomes of those things might be. So just a little bit of discussion about the discussion. So let's get in and talk about the court system then, our Chapter 3. Corporate governance, or governance that we have in our society, right? In a property-based environment, we have to have a viable court system. We have to know that our actions, that our contracts, that those types of things can be enforced. And we do, and my brother and I were even talking about this over the weekend. We were talking about some other cases and whatnot, and we were saying, how often we're critical of our system, and we are. I'm often critical about decisions and things that get made, and yet I would say, and support this wholeheartedly, say that our system's still much better probably than virtually any other system in the world, okay? It's not great, but we do a pretty good job, really, of trying to enforce these things and do it fairly, with due process and equal protection. We do a really good job compared to other places in the world, right? Okay. So why do we study law, business law? And you got to have understanding. In my former life as a banker, I talked to lawyers constantly. Maybe an average of once a day. There were literally days where my whole day was spent with lawyers, sometimes unfortunately in courts, be it bankruptcy court or other courts, trying to enforce our rights. Okay, So there was just a ton of time that was spent doing those things, and it was expensive if the lawyer had to educate me about certain aspects, and they did several times, right, of the law, and it was a lot better, especially as I got more experienced. Then it was a lot better that I already had an understanding of those things, and the lawyer in a minute and a half could explain to you what the situation was instead of having to walk you through everything for an hour and a half. So having a good understanding of our law, our legal system, and those types of things is extremely important. Okay, you will be probably, if you get involved in the business world, you're probably going to get involved in some court cases, whether you really want to or not. You might be a party, you might be a witness. Who knows? Those things can happen, and you get dragged into it, whether you really had anything to do with it or not. So we got all kinds of soaring legal costs, settlements, or lawsuits, that have taken place. I don't even think Quest is around anymore. Quest used to be our baby bell, that took care of ice, and Tyco. I think Tyco is still around. They had an interesting story about some partying and stuff that happened on the corporate dollar that probably shouldn't have. So what do we have? We have judges, magistrates, and justices, and for the most part, they determine the rules. Okay, they determine the rules of law. Okay, they do occasionally find facts. Okay, a jury generally decides questions of fact. Okay, and the judges or justices and magistrates, they make sure that the procedural rules and everything's followed, and that we follow the rule of law, right? There are times when judges are asked to make decisions or to find facts. We actually did that as a defendant. We would oftentimes choose, instead of electing our right to have a jury trial, we would say we want the judge to make that decision, and we would do that sometimes because we felt juries could easily be prejudiced against a bank, simply because banks are thought of to have deep pockets and can pay out claims and do those types of things, and it's an easy decision sometimes for a juror to make, and sometimes we felt a judge may be less emotional about those things. So you can set up trials to be that way, right? A trial judge renders a decision on a people conflict, so that's a people conflict, which would be a breach of contract or tort, those types of things, right? A civil case. Okay, justices as can a jury. Okay, justices deal with issues of law on appeal. That's a lot of their duty when you get past the state district level, right? Our Supreme Court. That's really all they hear. Or appeals cases. It's really an appeals court, and we'll go through this later, but a lot of the courts, above the trial courts, the basic trial courts, are appellate courts, and there are especially federal justice courts that serve both purposes. Judiciary and the power of judicial review, and there's been some interesting, there was when President Obama was making one of his State of the Union addresses, he mentioned something about the Supreme Court he thought was overstepping their bounds, and you could see one of the Supreme Court justices mouth some words, and they weren't positive towards the president in that case, and it was because of this. He was questioning their ability to review some of those things and whether or not those things should be left to Congress, and the justice obviously felt that no, the Supreme Court especially retains always the power of judicial review, which means that really any law that gets passed in the United States is subject ultimately to judicial review to determine whether it's constitutional or not, to determine if it fits our rule of law, right? Jurors they're a fact-finding body. It's called a petit jury. Usually 12. Some places are experimenting with smaller jurors. It's just cheaper, easier. Generally, the decisions come out to be pretty much the same. Okay. This is important to note because this certainly be on the test, and probably as you go through life, you need to know this, that criminal decisions are beyond a reasonable doubt, which means that the decision of the court in those cases has to be unanimous. I say usually unanimous. I think that you get to some jurisdictions, not Montana that I know of, but some jurisdictions, smaller state rules have probably said that maybe supermajorities for small crimes, but not for capital offenses like murder and those types of things. Those require unanimous decisions by the jury. Okay, the jury doesn't have to give a reason. Time to get a drink. I'm going to go back just briefly in case it doesn't get covered. But so what happens when a jury deadlocks? Right, and you'll see this sometimes when they can't come to a unanimous decision, because the unanimous decision has to be one way or the other, either guilty or innocent or acquittal. Then you have what's called a hung jury, and a hung jury results in a mistrial. And at that point in time, the prosecutors have to decide whether they want to pursue it again through another trial, which again gets expensive, right? So judges work jurors hard. You know, they really push them to try to come up with a unanimous decision. So lawyers, you know, oftentimes required, right? They're advocates for whoever it is they're representing. They have a duty, right, to administration of justice. They have a duty to protect their clients too, and they've got certainly lawyer-client privilege, which is a privacy issue, right? They serve as counselor and advocate, and as a public servant. Most of them, I believe, in most jurisdictions, they have some public service requirements actually when they come out. And here's the lawyer-client stuff is the confidential communications, right? The lawyer-client privilege. Our system's adversarial, right? It's you know, it's like we're combatants, and it is. It's set up to be that way. Not physical confrontation, but a war of words, right? And a war of evidence and presenting points of law and arguments and all those other things. And as we said in the prior slide, they function as lawyers do. So, you know, our courts are set up pretty much this way, right? We have a Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and we have trial courts, and certainly our federal courts are set up that way. So we'll talk about the two systems a little bit, federal versus state. And our federal court, there is a federal district. Montana is one federal district. You know, we got 1 million people, and there's one chief judge and a few other judges and some magistrates that handle the federal district of Montana for trial courts. Okay. Then there are courts of appeals, and there's somewhere between 12 and 14 of those in the state, and I'll talk about those later and explain why I kind of say 12 or 14. But Montana's in the Ninth Circuit, and so things that would be appealed from the federal district court can go to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and ultimately could be appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court, you know, acts as an appellate court also, right? So both of these are basically appellate courts. Okay. Our state, I want to go back though, because our state really skips. We don't have an intermediate court of appeals. We have trial courts, which are state district courts, and then we have the Supreme Court, which serves as an appellate court. Okay. State courts and the federal court too really are set up by the constitutions and set up by the legislatures. They establish, the states do, their own rules of procedure, although they have to, of course, be within the confines of the rule of law from the Constitution. Trial courts at the state level, they have different names, right? Superior Court, Circuit Court, District Court. We have, in Montana, we have justice courts, which are basically county or they're countywide courts, I'm sorry. There are some municipal courts or city courts. You know, Havre is big enough that, yes, we have a city court in Havre then to administer the laws that we have in town. Okay, and then we have a justice court that administers the laws that are within the county. Okay, then there are state district courts. Okay, and those encompass sometimes areas larger than counties, at least in our case, because we're fairly sparsely populated up here. Billings, on the other hand, might have a couple of district courts right within, you know, the city. I don't know exactly. Okay. And the lowest of those are actually the city courts or justice courts. Okay, and they're kind of similar, if you, I guess you'd say, in terms of their power, jurisdiction, and whatnot. One's just for the city, and one's for things that would happen outside the city. In our case, then. Okay, and those things can be reheard, okay, at state district court, and ultimately then could be appealed to the Supreme Court. Okay, those smaller courts, justice court and whatnot, they handle small violations. Okay, they're going to handle things in the city like speeding, stop sign violations, open container law, things like that, right? Justice court's going to handle more of the bigger felonies. Okay. And I don't know if that's a break, if it's from misdemeanor to felonies, it might be. I guess I should ask. But I think most of your felonies then go to district court. Things that would involve, of course, murder, grand theft, those types of things, right? Okay. At the trial courts, you know, that's where lawsuits, if it's one person suing another, or a complaint, if it's a public thing, so again, civil or criminal, and they determine facts and law. Okay. So it can be either a jury, or oftentimes the judge, you know, makes those decisions. Okay, appellate courts, they review questions of law, right? They don't rehash the facts, really. They just look at the questions of law. Were the proper laws followed in arriving at that decision? Okay. A petition for appeal is called apparently a writ of certiorari, or although when I've mentioned that to lawyers, they kind of look at me funny, like they're not sure what that means. So I think they just call it an appeal. I know that, you know, we had one case when I was at the bank that did go all the way to the Ninth Circuit Court, and there was a 3-judge panel. The headquarters for the Ninth Circuit's in San Francisco, but the 3-judge panel was actually in Seattle, which made it a little bit easier than having to go all the way to San Francisco. Small claims court, also called justice court. Okay, our justice court's also called small claims court, and vice versa, and our city court can act as a small claims court as well. Okay, they handle minor financial issues, and there's a limit, and I don't know exactly what the limit is. It's $5,000 or $7,000. Okay, and you know, so a landlord-tenant dispute or something like that, right, could simply go to small claims court and be handled in that fashion. Okay, benefits of that, it's informal, low court costs. Oftentimes lawyers don't get involved in that. Doesn't mean they can't necessarily, but oftentimes they don't when you're talking about minor issues. Okay. Federal courts are set up under Article 3 of the Constitution, right? And they handle questions of federal law. And there are certain laws that are federal laws that automatically fall under the jurisdiction of federal courts. Certain class action lawsuits, for example. Banks, if you rob a bank, you know, banks are federally protected, and so then you're going to have a federal issue. Issues that come out of tribal reservations and whatnot can be handled in the federal courts, right? Because the state courts technically don't have jurisdiction, right? So questions of federal law, you know, we talked about a few of those. You know, marijuana laws might come under federal court, right? Because states are in some cases legalizing them, but just so you know, marijuana is still illegal in every state in the United States, because there is a federal law that says marijuana is illegal. The federal government has openly said right now under this administration that they don't really care to enforce those laws. Okay, so while it's illegal, apparently it's not being enforced, but you know, I think that's important to know. The federal government could go to Colorado, Washington, or any other states that have legalized marijuana, and they could start throwing people in jail, okay, for violating federal law, because it still is illegal. Just as an example, if the U.S. is a party, right? So if the U.S. itself, the government's getting sued, or they're involved in it, state disagreements. You know, you might see a lot of water rights things there. You'll see some pollution, EPA types of things that come along. And then suits between citizens of different states, at least if they're for enough money, and I think that 75 grand I think might be the amount. Okay. Again, issues from the U.S. Constitution or Bill of Rights come into federal questions. Issues from federal statutes, no monetary limits, so could be a suit for damages. civil actions, and we've got federal things set up for patents and copyrights and trademarks, right? Federal taxes, of course, and some employment discrimination issues can certainly come up before the federal. And why do I say some? Because states have their own systems too, often, to deal with employment issues, and so it might depend on who you're employed with. The railroad is an interstate, for example, BNSF, an interstate company, and so a suit there would, in all likelihood, go through federal court. Okay. On the other hand, mom and pop store downtown, you'd go through the state system, and before you go through the courts, actually, you go through some administrative agencies. But the diversity of citizenship is the two people or two entities, because it could be corporations, right, that might be suing each other that live in different states. The Class Action Fairness Act, that was passed about 10 years ago now, and that really put in place the ability for large class action lawsuits to be held in federal courts versus state courts. So, general role of an appellate court is to, there you go, C, review questions of law. Okay, diversity of citizenship is plaintiffs, defendants, or citizens would have to be citizens of different states. If a corporation is a citizen of, right, so corporations might have a different citizenship, right? A lot of corporations, for example, incorporate in Delaware, and Northwestern Energy, which primarily does business in Montana, is incorporated in Delaware, right? So it's a citizen of Delaware, but it's also a citizen of Montana. Okay, because it's the state of its principal business, and you get bigger companies, and their principal business might be considered all over, if that makes sense. Okay, they might be considered a citizen of every state. Okay, possibly. Total activity test for a corporation. That's figuring out. Walmart sells $400 billion worth of stuff. How much do they sell in New York State? How much do they sell in California? Those types of things is where they figure out what the state of principal business is. Okay, claim has to be in excess of $75,000. So, a lot of claims against a Walmart, for example, would go through a state court. Okay, because you wouldn't be, if you were the plaintiff, you would be in the same state as them doing business here, even if they were incorporated in Delaware, right? Okay. Bigger claims, I'm trying to think what would cause that to go to federal court. I guess I'm not sure what type of activity would have to take place for that to end up in federal court. Because again, you take a Walmart, and they're a citizen probably of every state. Okay, just because of the way they do business. Amazon may be different, right? Even though they do a lot of shipping and stuff here, they don't have any warehouses or any physical presence in Montana. And so, to sue them, if it's an amount over $75,000 again, I guess that's where I got back, and I should have said that's where it would change, right? Because most cases against a Walmart or something are going to be far less than that. Okay. But if it's if it's an Amazon or something and it's over 75, yeah, you'd have to sue them in federal court, I'm sure. So, district courts, they're a federal trial court. Again, Montana is one district, right? They review lawsuits, so things can be appealed from the state Supreme Court to the federal district court, right? They can receive evidence and evaluate testimony. Now, they do that in a trial. They don't necessarily do that. They don't do that if they're doing an appeal. Okay, they impanel juries. Again, if they're a trial court, they do. If they're reviewing something on appeal, they don't. Okay, they resolve disputes between states and do those types of things. And the federal rules have their own procedures, right? Okay, this slide says there's 12 U.S. courts of appeals, and there's actually, these two are sometimes considered courts of appeals, and that's why I said it might be 12 to 14. The U.S. Claims Court is a place where administrative decisions can oftentimes be appealed to. And then there's a Court of Military Appeals that deals with just military law and military procedures. Okay, but there's 12 U.S. courts of appeal, and they're spread out around the country. We're in the Ninth Circuit, which includes huge. It's geographically, I think, the biggest, because it includes California, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, I think Nevada. I think we'll see a map here in a little bit. But it's a geographically huge area, and it's also fairly populous. I think it's both, it might be the biggest both geographically and by population. There's generally like 25 to 30 judges that serve in that Court of Appeals, and so I say ours is headquartered in San Francisco, but that doesn't mean all the judges reside there. Our case got heard in Seattle. So sometimes they'll do that depending on geographic considerations, but also the expertise maybe of the judges. Judges are going to get assigned to cases where they might have particular expertise when they're looking at it. So, yeah. Or the U.S. Court of Appeals out of San Francisco, or again the Ninth Circuit. Yeah, here's the map. So yeah, look at that, Arizona, California, Nevada. So it's a huge, geographic area, but it's also a large, when you throw California in there and Washington, well, and you got Alaska. So yeah, obviously, and Hawaii, geographically, Alaska is bigger than, any of the other districts, geographically. So huge, huge, huge. Again, the writ of certiorari is just, an appeal, right? When the Supreme Court makes a decision, it becomes the law of the land. So they are the final arbiter of all those things, right? Judicial review is the power to interpret, okay? And we've seen that, right? Now, we've seen that lately. There's a lot of cases, but you guys probably pay more attention to the big news ones. And there was the two cases that went to the Supreme Court regarding Obamacare, right? One was a couple of years ago. That really tried to lawsuits say whether or not Obamacare itself was even constitutional, and it really centered around whether the fine that people might pay for not having insurance is a tax or not. Okay, and that one went Obama's way. And then later there was one that was far more recently, just in the last several months, 6 months or so, was whether or not whether or not the federal government could actually have an exchange itself, or if it was meant to be for the states, because the language in Obamacare said states, but the Supreme Court interpreted that to more broadly and said, no, the intent was for exchanges to be set up whether the states actually had them or not, and so the federal government can have those exchanges. So in both cases, you'd say Obama's administration was a winner, which for the first one especially surprised a lot of people. They thought it might that Obamacare might actually get thrown out as a result of that tax, but it was called a fine in the deal, and if it was considered a fine, Obamacare would have gotten thrown out. But what the Supreme Court said is that regardless of what you call it, it is a tax, and Congress does have the right to levy taxes, and so that's why that one stayed. The law stayed in effect as a result of that decision, which again surprised quite a few people. Judicial restraint these are terms, right? And they're just terms that we say, those lawyers that practice judicial restraint, they believe in a strict view of the Constitution, right? They think changes should come from the political process, and that the court should kind of stay out of things other than maybe determining rights and wrongs, or whether a particular law meets the Constitution or not. Judicial activism is an approach where justices actually use the court maybe to somehow correct society wrongs. It's a little more value oriented. You can take your pick which one you think is better, and there's not a line that's drawn there, and you're either on this side or that side. They're not mutually exclusive. On certain issues, some justices may practice restraint, and on other issues they may practice activism. So kind of hard to say, but is the power of judicial review important? Absolutely. I think some of us, myself included, might argue that it's perhaps one of the more important powers of the Constitution, that we do have a separate body, not really an elected body. They're appointed and confirmed by the Senate, but this separate body to look at laws and determine if those laws fall within the rule of the Constitution. And I think that's absolutely important. So. Just trying to see if there's really anything important, terribly important here. Not really. So we talk about case law, right? And case law, or common law, then is precedent oriented, and precedents are huge. We go by prior cases and the rulings that judges made in order to make determinations. Oftentimes we say that the advantages are that it's predictable and certain. Cases I was involved in, I would tell you that I didn't find it as predictable as I would have liked to have believed, but it establishes how we're going to proceed, and there's landmark cases that really do establish precedents that then don't get overthrown and whatnot, and future cases then are settled as a result of that. And sometimes they'll go against precedents, though. So I would be down here where it says precedent may be rejected, but disadvantages of it, there's huge cases, right? We've got a huge judicial system that's expensive, it's time consuming. You guys will see cases where that an event happened, and it's years before the person's ever really even brought to trial. And why is that? Part of it is the volume of cases in the court, but people are entitled to a speedy trial, right? And I've posed that question to like our district attorney or county attorney, and she told me, she said, well, what generally happens is it's the defendant, not generally, always, it's the defendant that's looking to delay those things and take as much time as possible. We're seeing that. The case, the local business person that was involved with Rocky Boy in terms of one of the issues out there, and it's been ongoing. Several people have already been tried or pled and have been sentenced and have served their sentences and are actually out of jail, and yet the local agribusiness person hasn't even come to trial yet. Okay, and that's been a couple of years, so lengthy sometimes. Okay, it's very expensive. Dicta is statements not relevant to the decision, and sometimes oftentimes dicta maybe comes from the side that didn't prevail. So it might be a 5-4 decision, and somebody will write the decision for the winning side, if you want to call it the winning side, prevailing side. But oftentimes there'll be comments from those on the other side, and that's kind of called dicta, and they'll explain why they were thinking what they thought. Because later that could be used almost like a precedent, right? But precedents can be rejected. We've got a multitude of systems, right, between states, between levels, jurisdiction, those types of things, and so there can be conflicts there. So nature of a judicial process, sure, they use existing statutes and precedent. They create law where none exists. And we call some laws by their judicial name, like Miranda v. Arizona, to get the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent, and on and on and on, right? And Roe v. Wade, right? The right for women to have an abortion. Okay, those were laws that were really created then by court decisions. Okay, and they can certainly refuse to apply case law or find something unconstitutional. So they can, not hear a case really. Okay? And this is ultimately what they look at, right? Montana's court system. This is part of your assignment. So if you were smart and you actually looked ahead in the PowerPoint, you were supposed to come up with something that looked just like this. So if you were smart, you just got it right from the PowerPoint here. But most people I found don't look ahead to the PowerPoint, so I always find that interesting. But anyhow, we have a Supreme Court with 7 justices, right? District court, it says it covers all 56 counties, but there's only 43 actual districts, right? Because for example, the 12th district up here, I think, covers Hill County, Liberty County, and Northern Choteau County. So it covers like 2.5 counties. Okay, there are separate courts for workers' comp and water court. You know, we've decided that those two issues are specialized enough that we need separate courts to deal with those, and so they do, and so there's experts that, you know, experts in those fields that serve as judges, right? Then we have the justice courts and the municipal courts and city courts, and these are all basically under, you know, at the same level. Okay, 65 justice courts, so yeah, that's like ours is one county, it's Hill County, but there are probably bigger communities, Billings, Missoula, and those places that have more than one justice court. Municipal courts, there's not a lot of municipal courts. Wow. Interesting. Okay. But there are city courts. And the difference between a municipal court and a city court, I can't really tell you. I don't know that there is a ton of a difference. You know, you can see that they handle basically the same exact cases and whatnot. So, okay. If you lost, who should you turn to for advice? Should you destroy your report? Oh, there was a case, I think, in the book that referred to. So, wow. I don't know what the heck we got going on there. Why you're okay. Let's go. There's a couple more things I want to look at here just real quickly. I want to talk about the Supreme Court. I think this might be part of your assignment too. I'm not sure it was. So who's the Chief Justice, right? Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. Okay, he was appointed by George W. in 2005. He replaced William Rehnquist, who passed away. And actually, he was going to replace the retiring Sandra Day O'Connor, but in the process between his nomination and actually appointment, Rehnquist had passed away, and so John Roberts was appointed not only to the Supreme Court, but he was appointed as the Chief Justice. My computer's slowing down or stopping on me. There's 3 women now in the Supreme Court. Justice O'Connor was the first woman ever appointed, and we've had several subsequently, and I think she's been appointed and retired. I think all the other gals that have been appointed are still on the court. My computer's just not wanting to do what it's supposed to do here, guys. Sorry. I'll see if I can just enlarge this, but I can't get it to come up. Yeah, let's hit that. Sometimes that makes it work. I'm sorry. So let's see if we can, okay. And these 3 are serving right now: Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I've had this problem. The Supreme Court doesn't like to have its picture taken. Okay, and so it's tough to find an actual current picture of the Supreme Court, and so I've had to impose or put these. I'm not a very good Photoshop person, but I've had to put the pictures in there. So how many justices are there? There's 9. Okay. President Roosevelt, Franklin, he famously sought to increase the size of the court because he wanted to appoint more people that would be wanted to act in his behalf, kind of, for some of the things he wanted to get done, and the Supreme Court said no, 9's the number. So how are they selected? Right, appointed by the president, but they have to be confirmed. Okay, confirmed by the United States Supreme Court. So the advice, they say, and consent of the United States Senate. Oh, I said Supreme Court, but the United States Senate has to confirm them. Okay. How long do they serve for? They can serve for life, right? Or until they choose to retire. Okay. And some of them, you know, you look at the picture, some of those folks are getting up there, okay? But they'll tend to stay on. This is perhaps current. I'm not sure for the Montana Supreme Court. I think, as of last January. It should still be current, I believe. So, okay. Just a brief to give you a little insight. I think I've got one more here that's a quick one that we talk about appeals, right? Oops, I clicked on the wrong thing there. Okay, let's get that. You lose in justice court in Havre, where are you going to appeal to? You can appeal, you can take that to state district court where it's said to be reheard, but it's basically an appeal. Supreme Court of the state of Montana rejects your claim, then where do you go? Then you'd go to the federal district court in Montana. Okay, it would take that route and go there. The chief federal district judge in Montana is known to his wife and kids as Dana, and I might have spelled that wrong too. It's Christensen, I think. Maybe I got that right. He's the chief judge right now. The chief judge is no higher really than the other judges when it comes to the federal district court. But they have the responsibility of assigning the cases, I think, is the main thing. A jury in the 12th District Court for the state of Montana finds for your opponent. She says she'll appeal. Where's she going to appeal to? That's going to go to the state Supreme Court, right? Okay, from federal district court, Judge Siebel, he's gone now, but we should throw in Christensen or somebody else. Okay, because there are 3 judges at least. Okay, you would appeal to, and in our case, that would go to the 9th Circuit, right? So from our federal court, it's got to go to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. Kelo versus New London, you'd have to look ahead a little bit. This was a huge case regarding eminent domain, and it's one of those real precedent kind of establishing cases, you know, like I talked about a little bit earlier. Huge, okay? And it went all the way to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that New London should be victorious and that they should allow the condemnation of Kelo's home and pay fair market value for it, and then there was a development that wanted to take place. How many different courts are located in Havre? We actually have 3. We've got city court, we've got a justice court, and we've got the state district court. All 3 located here, so no shortage of places. Embezzling 20 grand in Havre is going to land you where? It's going to take you to state district court. Again, the amounts, you know, you get up into anything over 7 grand, I think is what the slide said. Then it becomes a felony big enough that it's going to go to state district court, right? The name of the judge for us, the 12th district, is Dan Boucher. Oh, I don't know if this thing still works. It's kind of fun. You can go and try to see how long you can keep the drunk standing upright. So if he got arrested, he'd end up in city court. So justice courts, or our county-wide courts, also known as small claims court. But again, I think our city courts can also handle small claims. I think they do go to the district court, justice court, I'm sorry. They go to the justice court, small claims do, unless small claims is something wrong. Okay, the judge is on vacation or something like that, then it might go to the city court. So while practicing golf and drinking beer in his backyard, your neighbor shanks a shot, misses his practice net, and puts a top flight XL3000 through your bay window. Not only does the window break, the ball smashes a nearly priceless Ming Voss valued at over $7,000. Your neighbor denies responsibility, attempting to avoid a citation for drunken driving. You'll have to sue your neighbor in. Again, that's going to go state district court. The $7,000 probably being the thing there. So, short the price of a pint, Al Bierman decides to try and rob a bank. Luckily, the bank president misses Al with his Glock 9mm handgun. Al's merely arrested. Al's going to make his first court appearance in what court? That's going to be a federal court. Again, banks are federally protected, so there's federal law there. Recently passed, and that's been about 10 years ago now, but fairly recent. Okay, it requires certain action to be heard in what courts? That's going to be federal. Okay, so class action, the class action fairness. What happened there? Just to give you a real brief story about that was, a lot of class action lawsuits were occurring in state district courts, and lawyers, plaintiff lawyers, and were really smart, and they would find a district that they thought would feel good about their plaintiffs, and that would more likely and believe it, they had them identified on the map. You know, they knew where lawsuits tended to be successful, and so they could pick those districts oftentimes depending on the suit and the company and whatnot, and have the trial there. And they knew juries in those communities to be very sympathetic, and so they'd try to do that. The Class Action Fairness Act kind of cleaned that up and said, nah, you know, if it's over, I think, $5 million, and there's, you know, so many folks or whatever, we're going to do it in a federal court. So I think that kind of covers it. whipped through it, but 50 minutes, that's about right. So hope you guys hope you had a good Labor Day. I forgot to mention that. That's a big deal. We'll talk about labor law a little later in the semester, but I hope everybody had a good Labor Day, and welcome back and get to work again.